That's right. I am Kira.
Before the year 2015, I had never watched a single anime series. I was always interested, but I never got around to it. My senior year of high school was finishing up, so I had a bunch of time to kill. Breaking Bad was over, and I had just finished watching The Wire. I decided that I needed a break from intense dramas and wanted something fresh, but quality. I figured it was the perfect opportunity to finally sit down and watch an anime. After relaying this news to one of my closest friends, he recommended one immediately. Deathnote. So I looked it up and was sold right away. The concept alone was enough to grab my interest, and luckily, it was on Netflix at the time. I didn't read the manga or anything, so I went in completely blind. After a few weeks, I finished watching all 37 episodes, and my immediate reaction was that it was one of the greatest shows I had ever watched, live action included. The character depth, the soundtrack, the masterclass display in deductive reasoning, and in my humble opinion, the greatest cat and mouse game ever displayed on a visual medium. Everything about it was absolutely phenomenal, and I remember feeling incredibly satisfied with its ending. To me, Deathnote set the standard for anime shows going forward. Anytime I would have a discussion with someone and they'd tell me their favorite anime or what they thought the best was, I'd ask, but is it better than Deathnote? So after watching the show for the first time, I looked up a few articles and videos to see what people thought about it, and as expected, there was nothing but critical acclaim. Except for one thing. It's important to highlight that there are two parts to Deathnote. Episode 1 to episode 26 being the first, and episode 27 to episode 37 being the second. It's no surprise why everyone holds the first part of the show in such high regard. Memorable scenes, two incredibly written characters going back and forth in a game of chess, one-upping each other, everything carefully and meticulously thought of and planned out. Up until this point, the show was nearly flawless, and episode 25 where Elle dies is an underappreciated masterpiece in television history. But after that is where the discourse starts. I would constantly see people say, yeah, the first part of the show is legendary, but it falls off after Elle dies. At the time, I was confused. Of course the show was better with Elle, who is one of the greatest fictional characters of all time, but I didn't think the second part of the show had the massive drop in quality that most people were saying. I became defensive over it, because I was so protective of the show. And I also had Attack on Titan fans yelling in my ear the entire time. Fast forward 8 years later, and I finally decided to rewatch Deathnote. It was time to relive greatness. It was time to relive one of the best shows ever. It was time to reassess the part that makes some people say, yeah, but. And after finally rewatching it, I can confidently say that this is still one of the greatest shows I have ever seen. But most importantly, the second part of it is overhated. Now that I have a better understanding of what makes a good television show and just being less angry than I was back then, I was able to analyze the final 11 episodes with a more level-headed approach. That being said, yes, the second part of Deathnote is flawed. The first thing that came to mind was how incredibly rushed it is and how that affected so many new characters and plot points. The two new major players we are introduced to are Nier and Mello, both of who were primed to be successors of Elle. The focus is primarily on Nier, who is almost a carbon copy of Elle but is younger and plays with toys. It never seemed like Nier was on the verge of losing or at the very least being cornered. He deduces that Light is Kira and that Mikami is the one writing names in the Deathnote for him way too quickly. He always had an answer for everything right away, and it never felt like he was on the ropes. Mello, on the other hand, was far more interesting than Nier. Personality-wise, he stood in stark contrast to Elle, and the inner conflict he has within himself of trying to prove that he's equal to or even ahead of Nier's level seemed like a much more intriguing route to explore. But even putting aside any suggestions of more compelling arcs, The fact that both characters were only afforded 11 episodes worth of screen time compared to L's 24 put them at a disadvantage with the audience because there just wasn't enough time to fall for them like we did with L. Mikami being an extreme loyalist who is chosen by his god to write down names in the Deathnote for him is an interesting concept, but it was a major plotline with major implications that was added too late. His backstory of how he became who he is was slightly underwhelming and needed to be built up more. It seemed as if we were forced to feel sympathy for his character, but a flashback of his childhood and teenage years during one episode wasn't enough. The idea of his god letting him down in the finale would have hit differently if his development was more of a main priority and not just a throw-in. Early on in the show, we learned that Ryuk has an extra notebook only for us to find out that he ended up stealing Sido's. Sido wanting to take his Death Note back should have been something that was hinted at earlier in the show and not 28 episodes in. The fact that he took this long to decide to take it back was odd, and it felt like this was only done to get rid of one of the real notebooks, so the pathway of catching Light wouldn't be too convoluted as the show is ending. Just my 2 cents. Something about Light in the final episodes felt off compared to Light in the first part of the show. He just seemed a bit less cautious than he was against L. And I understand the argument that he didn't feel as threatened by Nier and Mello as he was by L, but Light is someone who takes everything into account, especially when he feels cornered. He makes questionable choices like convincing followers to charge at SPK headquarters right after Nier suspects he's Kira, and speaking to Takeda without cameras on, not understanding the possible suspicion that either of those decisions can create. It just felt like Light had his guard down, which was uncharacteristic of him. Few side notes, there were way too many Death Notes in the second part of the show, including fake ones, and it was difficult to keep up with at times. It kind of felt like people were playing hot potato with them, and the fact that they were getting into the hands of so many people somewhat diminished the allure of them. Also, not sure why they introduced the new opening theme during the first part. It would have been more fitting to introduce it after L died, since it was a new chapter and they wanted to revamp the aesthetic. Still a banger of a song though. So yeah, the second part of Death Note is indeed messy. Some thought the show could have ended after L died, but maybe if these plot points were fleshed out and had a bit more time, the perception would have been slightly different. That being said, there are a lot of positives. A major strength of Death Note is the supporting characters, and 2 of them who had their defining moments were Aizawa and Matsuda. Aizawa is an intelligent individual who takes his career very seriously. We see someone who's steadfast in his beliefs, and once he has a feeling Light is Kira, he follows through with his instincts. He even goes against Nier's orders in the finale when he tells him to not chase Light since he'll die anyway. Aizawa felt like a main player in the final episodes as he plays an integral role in taking down Light. Matsuda is undoubtedly the comic relief of Death Note. You can argue Ryuk too. And that stays pretty consistent throughout, but he can also be considered the heart of the show. There are 2 pivotal moments in the second part that contribute to Matsuda's development. In episode 30, he sums up the thought process we as the viewer have while watching the show. Death Note forces us to consider what's right and what's wrong. Should we be angry if there's less evil in the world even if it's at the expense of the lives of those who cause it? Therefore, is Kira completely wrong in what he does? Matsuda addresses this. It's fitting that this comes from the heart of the show. Matsuda's speech was a moment of reassurance to the audience. It tells us that maybe we're not wrong for thinking this. The other moment occurs in the finale. Matsuda shoots Light's hand in order to prevent him from writing names in the piece of paper from the Death Note he hid in his watch. He stands up against Light and also defends Chief Yagami's honor while doing so. Matsuda really shines in this scene and his character comes full circle. A good-hearted guy who isn't taken too seriously becomes a hero in one of the most crucial moments of the series. While the Death Note is the catalyst for the events that transpire throughout the show, the first part was mostly about Light versus L. However, the stakes felt much grander in the second part. A large part of society has accepted Kira, and his ideologies and beliefs have now spread globally. He's seen as a godlike figure, which was Light's goal from the beginning, and has media outlets dedicated to him as people vie to be his spokesperson and carry his message. This is something that isn't outside the realm of possibility in 2023. It shows us that in the 16 years since the show ended, we as a society haven't really changed much. People divided, inflated senses of self-righteousness, contrarian mindsets emerging just to disrupt the status quo even if they know what's truly right deep down. Media influencing our day-to-day lives as they highlight whatever gets the most traction, good or bad, especially bad, even if it means causing the mental and physical discomfort of people. This was a standout aspect of the second part because it's a dark reflection of our society as a whole. Sometimes, there's no escaping the wrong in the world, and therefore, we just become immune to every awful thing that happens next. Coping becomes our new normal. The final episode of Deathnote was one of the best episodes of the entire show and a fitting end to the story. By the way, if you watch the English dub version, Brad Swaley gives one of the best voice acting performances ever, and should be praised more. The episode was chaotic and violent, from Light's speech justifying his actions and saying that only he could have pulled this off, to Matsuda having a heroic moment, to Mikami committing suicide in an absolute bloodbath, to Light running away as the sun sets and seeing a younger version of himself before picking up the notebook, perhaps regretting his actions and thinking what could have been, to him dying in the middle of a staircase, not at the bottom, not at the top, similar to what will happen to him next. Not heaven, not hell, but nothingness, followed by the perfect shot of L appearing before him, his equal, his kryptonite, the only one who challenged him, the only one who helped give Light a sense of self-worth. So yes, the second part of Deathnote isn't as good as the first part, but it's not bad by any means. A key takeaway is how much L meant to so many people's enjoyment of the show, and understandably so. He's one of the greatest characters ever written, and his absence is for sure felt in the final episodes. But maybe people went into the second part knowing they wouldn't like it as much because their favorite character who they loved wasn't there anymore, thus not giving it a fair shot. It was kind of a predetermined thing. Nevertheless, the show is still an all-time great, and it's safe to assume that most people would agree. Deathnote is a masterclass in storytelling that should be studied by artists everywhere. The characters, the unique concept, the execution, it has everything a storyteller dreams of creating. It may not be everyone's favorite anime, but there's no denying its greatness. Ultimately, it's important that everyone gives anime a shot. It will introduce you to stories that you never thought could possibly work. Stories that can change your life, expand your imagination, and make you a better artist. Deathnote did that for me.